Have you ever watched someone you care about build walls so high that even their own heart can't see over them? This invisible fortress isn't made of stone or steel, but of something far more complex: the quiet war inside every avoidant heart. Every day, millions of people fight this battle, pushing away the very connections they secretly crave, all while convincing themselves they're better off alone. Think about Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl. On the surface, she appeared confident and untouchable, surrounding herself with luxury and control. Yet beneath that perfectly polished exterior lived someone terrified of being truly seen, someone who learned early that vulnerability meant danger. This internal conflict plays out in countless hearts around the world, creating a paradox that seems impossible to solve: the simultaneous need for love and the compulsive drive to reject it. The human brain, magnificent as it is, can become its own worst enemy when it comes to relationships. Picture a security system that's so sensitive, it treats every act of kindness as a potential threat. This isn't stubbornness or cruelty. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism that once served a purpose but now imprisons the very person it was meant to protect. The avoidant heart doesn't reject love because it doesn't want it. It rejects love because wanting it feels too dangerous to bear. What makes this internal war particularly devastating is how it operates in the shadows of consciousness. The avoidant person often doesn't realize they're sabotaging their own happiness. They experience the world through a lens colored by confirmation bias. Their mind actively seeks evidence that relationships are unreliable, that people will eventually leave, and that independence is the only true safety. Every small disappointment becomes proof of their worldview, while acts of genuine love get dismissed as temporary or somehow flawed. Consider Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You. While his extreme behaviors are obviously problematic, his underlying pattern reveals something familiar: the way he simultaneously craves deep connection while being fundamentally unable to trust it. He creates elaborate fantasies of perfect love while systematically destroying any real intimacy that comes his way. This represents the avoidant paradox taken to its extreme, but the core struggle exists in much subtler forms in everyday relationships. The tragedy of avoidant attachment lies not in the absence of feeling, but in the presence of too much feeling that has nowhere safe to go. These hearts beat with the same longing as any other, but they've learned to translate that longing into something that feels more manageable: distance, control, or intellectual analysis of emotions rather than experiencing them directly. The war rages between what they want and what they believe they can survive wanting. Understanding this battle requires recognizing how early experiences shape the architecture of trust. When a child learns that reaching out leads to disappointment or that emotional needs are burdens, they adapt by becoming strategically self-reliant. This adaptation is actually brilliant in its own way. It's a survival strategy that works. The problem emerges when this childhood solution becomes an adult prison, limiting not just romantic relationships but friendships, family connections, and even the relationship with oneself. But here's what most people miss about avoidant hearts: their capacity for loyalty and depth runs deeper than many realize. When they do form connections, these bonds often possess a quality of thoughtfulness and intention that's remarkable. They don't love easily, but when they do love, it's with a careful consideration of what that love means. The challenge lies in helping them recognize that this capacity for deep feeling doesn't have to be their enemy. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now imagine Sarah, a marketing executive who had everything mapped out perfectly. Her apartment was immaculate, her career trajectory clear, and her social calendar filled with activities that made her look wonderfully connected to life. She dated regularly, but never for more than a few months. There was always something wrong. He was too clingy, or not ambitious enough, or simply not quite right. Her friends envied her freedom and independence, never suspecting the exhausting vigilance required to maintain such careful distance from genuine intimacy. The turning point came not through some dramatic revelation, but through something deceptively simple: her neighbor's cat. The elderly woman next door asked Sarah to feed her cat while she visited family for a week. Sarah agreed reluctantly, viewing it as a minor inconvenience. But something unexpected happened during those daily visits to the small apartment. The cat, initially wary, began to approach her with cautious curiosity. By the third day, it was purring when she arrived. By the seventh day, it had fallen asleep in her lap. This tiny creature's gradual trust triggered something Sarah hadn't anticipated: tears. Not sad tears, but something deeper and more confusing. She realized she couldn't remember the last time any living being had moved toward her with such uncomplicated affection. The cat didn't analyze her worthiness or question her motives. It simply recognized kindness and responded accordingly. For the first time in years, Sarah glimpsed what she'd been protecting herself from: the terrifying beauty of being chosen by another heart. But the story doesn't end with this moment of clarity, because real change never happens that simply. When her neighbor returned and reclaimed the cat, Sarah felt a loss that surprised her with its intensity. She found herself making excuses to visit, bringing unnecessary gifts, extending conversations far longer than politeness required. The old woman, wise in the way that comes from decades of observing human nature, simply smiled and suggested Sarah might enjoy having a pet of her own. The suggestion terrified Sarah more than any boardroom presentation ever had. Here's where the plot thickens in the most human way possible. Sarah spent 3 weeks researching pets with the same intensity she brought to work projects. She read about different breeds, visited shelters multiple times without adopting anything, and created elaborate pros and cons lists. Her friends found this behavior amusing, not realizing they were witnessing someone's first tentative steps toward allowing dependence into her life. The question wasn't really about choosing the right pet. It was about whether she could trust herself to care for something without eventually disappointing it, or being disappointed herself. The climax of Sarah's story came not at the animal shelter, but in her therapist's office the following month. She'd been seeing Dr. Martinez for several weeks, initially framing her sessions as optimization meetings for her already successful life. But on this particular Tuesday, she found herself describing the cat incident with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Dr. Martinez listened with the kind of attention Sarah wasn't used to receiving: patient, non-judgmental, consistently present week after week, regardless of what Sarah brought to the sessions. "What scares you most about getting a pet?" Dr. Martinez asked, and Sarah's carefully constructed response crumbled before she could speak it. Instead, words tumbled out that she'd never said aloud. "What if I love it, and then I ruin everything like I always do? What if I stop being able to take care of it properly? What if it gets sick and I have to watch it suffer? What if I'm just not built for this kind of responsibility?" The questions revealed the tender truth beneath all her romantic relationships. Not that she couldn't love, but that she loved so intensely it terrified her. That session marked the beginning of Sarah's real journey, not toward becoming someone different, but toward accepting who she'd always been underneath the protective strategies. She did eventually adopt a cat, a senior orange tabby named Frank, who seemed as cautiously optimistic about companionship as she was. Their relationship became a kind of training ground for trust, a place where Sarah could practice staying present with another being's needs without losing herself completely. But that's just the beginning of understanding how to navigate the landscape of an avoidant heart. Think of Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris. Her relentless optimism and boundary-crossing behavior might seem like the opposite of avoidance, but notice how she consistently chooses complicated situations that prevent real intimacy. She pursues unavailable men, throws herself into work challenges that keep her emotionally occupied, and maintains a cheerful distance from the deeper implications of her choices. This represents another flavor of avoidant behavior, staying busy enough that the heart never has to settle into the vulnerable stillness where real connection happens. The first step in working with avoidant patterns involves recognizing them without judgment. This isn't about fixing something broken, but about understanding a system that once worked perfectly for its intended purpose. Every avoidant strategy developed as a smart response to specific circumstances. The goal isn't to eliminate these responses entirely, but to expand the menu of options available when facing emotional situations. Like learning a new language, this process requires patience and practice. Start by noticing the physical sensations that accompany emotional distance. When someone expresses affection or makes a request for deeper connection, what happens in the body? Does the chest tighten? Do the shoulders rise? Does breathing become shallow? These physical signals often appear before conscious thoughts kick in, and learning to recognize them creates a window of choice that didn't exist before. The sensation isn't wrong or something to be fought. It's information about how the nervous system has learned to protect itself. The next step involves experimenting with very small doses of vulnerability, much like building tolerance to a new medication. This might mean sharing one genuine feeling per week with a trusted friend, or asking for help with something minor, or simply staying in a conversation for 30 seconds longer after the impulse to leave arises. The key lies in making these experiments small enough that they don't trigger the entire defense system, but substantial enough that new neural pathways begin to form. Here's what most advice misses about working with avoidant attachment. The process isn't about becoming more emotionally expressive or suddenly comfortable with dependency. It's about expanding the range of responses available in intimate moments. An avoidant person might never become someone who easily shares every feeling, but they can learn to communicate their care in ways their partner can receive. They might never love being needed, but they can learn to recognize their own needs and ask for support occasionally. The cognitive bias that most powerfully supports avoidant patterns is called the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge the likelihood of future events based on how easily we can remember similar past events. If someone's most vivid relationship memories involve disappointment, betrayal, or engulfment, their brain will automatically assess new relationships as high-risk ventures. This isn't conscious decision-making. It's the mind's attempt to keep them safe based on previous data. Countering this bias requires deliberately collecting new data points that challenge the old narrative. This means paying attention to moments when people are reliably present, when conflicts get resolved successfully, when intimacy leads to greater safety rather than danger. At first, these positive experiences might feel like exceptions or flukes. The avoidant mind is skilled at explaining away evidence that contradicts its protective worldview. But over time, with consistent attention, new patterns of evidence begin to accumulate. One practical technique involves keeping what therapists call a relationship evidence journal. Each day, write down one small example of someone being trustworthy, supportive, or genuinely caring. These don't have to be romantic examples. They might include a colleague who kept a confidence, a cashier who was patient during a complicated transaction, or a friend who checked in during a difficult week. The goal is to train attention toward the reliability that already exists in daily life, but often gets overlooked by minds focused on potential threats. Another powerful approach involves learning to distinguish between different types of closeness. Many avoidant people operate with a binary understanding of relationships, either complete independence or total engulfment, with no middle ground visible. In reality, intimacy comes in countless varieties, and finding the types that feel sustainable makes all the difference. Some people connect most comfortably through shared activities rather than long conversations. Others feel closest when they're working together toward common goals. Some experience intimacy through humor, others through quiet presence. The art lies in communicating these preferences clearly rather than simply avoiding connection altogether. Instead of disappearing when a relationship starts feeling too intense, an avoidant person can learn to say something like, "I care about you and I need a little space to process these feelings. Can we talk again in a couple days?" This maintains the connection while honoring the need for emotional breathing room. It's a radical shift from the all-or-nothing approach that typically characterizes avoidant patterns. Understanding triggers becomes crucial in this process. What specific behaviors or situations most reliably activate the urge to withdraw? Common triggers include being asked about feelings directly, having someone express strong emotions, being needed for emotional support, or feeling like someone's happiness depends on their response. Once these triggers are identified, it becomes possible to prepare for them differently. Instead of being hijacked by automatic responses, there's space to choose more conscious reactions. For instance, if being asked, "How was your day?" typically triggers annoyance or withdrawal because it feels like pressure to perform emotional availability, try preparing a few genuine but simple responses in advance. "It was productive, thanks for asking," or "challenging but good," provides real information without requiring deep emotional excavation. The person asking gets acknowledgement of their care, and the avoidant person gets to practice staying present in small talk without feeling overwhelmed by expectations. Working with avoidant patterns also means learning to recognize and communicate limits before they're crossed. Most avoidant people are extremely tolerant until suddenly they're not, at which point they tend to withdraw completely rather than negotiate boundaries. Learning to say, "I'm reaching my limit for emotional conversations today, but I'd like to continue this tomorrow," prevents the all-or-nothing shutdown that damages relationships and reinforces avoidant beliefs about incompatibility. The relationship with oneself requires as much attention as relationships with others. Avoidant people often maintain the same emotional distance from their own feelings that they create with other people. They might know they're stressed or frustrated, but have difficulty accessing the more vulnerable emotions underneath: sadness, loneliness, fear, or longing. Developing internal emotional vocabulary becomes essential for communicating with others about what's actually happening inside. This internal work might involve spending a few minutes each day simply noticing what feelings are present without trying to change or analyze them. What does disappointment feel like in the body? Where does anxiety show up physically? What happens internally when someone expresses care or affection? This isn't about becoming more emotional, but about becoming more aware of emotions that are already there, but often ignored or intellectualized. Remember that progress in attachment healing rarely moves in straight lines. There will be periods of openness followed by periods of withdrawal, moments of breakthrough followed by temporary returns to old patterns. This isn't failure, it's the natural rhythm of nervous system change. The goal isn't to never feel the urge to withdraw, but to have more choices about how to respond to that urge. Building secure relationships as an avoidant person often means finding partners and friends who can appreciate indirect expressions of care. Someone who shows love through actions rather than words needs people who can recognize and value those actions. Someone who expresses concern by solving problems rather than offering emotional support needs relationships where problem solving is received as the gift it's intended to be. This doesn't mean avoiding growth, but it does mean honoring authentic ways of connecting while gradually expanding the repertoire. The journey toward more secure attachment patterns takes tremendous courage, especially for those whose early experiences taught them that emotional needs were dangerous luxuries they couldn't afford. Every small step toward greater intimacy represents a victory over powerful internal forces that would prefer the familiar territory of independence. The quiet war inside every avoidant heart isn't between love and fear. It's between the part that wants to trust and the part that remembers why trust felt impossible. As we reach the end of this exploration, consider how the landscape of love looks different when viewed through the lens of compassion rather than judgment. The avoidant heart isn't broken or defective. It's a masterpiece of adaptation that learned to survive in circumstances where emotional openness felt too risky. The strategies that once provided essential protection can evolve into tools for conscious connection when approached with patience and understanding. Sarah's story continues today, years after that first encounter with her neighbor's cat. Frank, the orange tabby, lived with her for 6 beautiful years before passing away peacefully in his sleep. The grief Sarah felt surprised everyone, including herself, with its intensity and duration. But instead of interpreting this pain as evidence that caring leads inevitably to suffering, she recognized it as proof of her capacity for deep love. The hurt validated the connection rather than negating it. She eventually adopted 2 more cats and began volunteering at the animal shelter, where she'd spent so many anxious weeks researching the perfect pet. Her relationships with humans evolved more slowly, but just as surely. She learned to stay in conversations past the point of comfort, to ask friends for help with small things, and to express appreciation directly rather than only through actions. She never became someone who shares feelings easily, but she became someone who can acknowledge feelings when they matter to people she cares about. The marketing executive who once changed subjects whenever conversations became too personal now mentors younger colleagues not just in professional skills, but in recognizing their own worth and potential. She speaks about resilience and self-reliance, but also about the courage required to let others matter. Her apartment is still organized and beautiful, but it's also clearly a place where friends are welcome, where spontaneous conversations happen, where life is lived rather than simply managed. This transformation didn't require Sarah to become a different person. She's still someone who values independence, who prefers showing care through actions rather than words, who needs time alone to process emotions before sharing them. But now these preferences exist as choices rather than compulsions. She can recognize when her instinct to withdraw is protective versus when it's unnecessary. She can communicate her needs clearly rather than simply disappearing when relationships become challenging. The quiet war inside every avoidant heart ends not with surrender, but with integration. The parts that learned to protect through distance don't disappear. They learn to work alongside the parts that long for connection. The result isn't a personality transplant, but a more complete version of who that person has always been underneath the armor of self-protection. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, remember that awareness itself is the first victory in this internal war. Every moment of recognizing an avoidant impulse creates space for choice that didn't exist before. Every small.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.